Welcome to Top 10 Secret, where we uncover the most chilling mysteries and terrifying curses. Today, we explore top 10 most terrifying curses of the black-horned demon. Haunting tales of vengeance, restless spirits, and eerie shadows that remain unexplained. Warning: these stories are not for the faint of heart. Do you dare to step into the world of cursed darkness? If you're ready, let's begin. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with our next horrifying stories. Story 1. The Curse of the Black-Horned Demon. In a forgotten forest, shrouded in eternal shadow and silence, an ancient evil stirs. The villagers who live on the outskirts of this cursed land speak in hushed tones of a creature known as the Black-Horned Demon. A twisted monstrosity with horns spiraling skyward, empty eyes that see beyond the veil of death, and a scream that can shatter souls. They warn all who pass through their town: never enter the forest after dusk, for the demon watches, and it hungers. Centuries ago, a powerful sorcerer named Malric dwelled in the heart of the forest. Obsessed with immortality, Malric delved into forbidden rituals, communing with forces from the abyss. On the night of a blood moon, he performed his ultimate ritual, summoning a demonic entity to grant him eternal life. But Malric's arrogance blinded him to the cost. The entity twisted his body and soul, transforming him into a creature of pure horror. His flesh rotted, his bones warped, and his mind shattered, leaving behind only a ravenous thirst for human souls. As punishment for his hubris, the demon's essence was bound to the forest. The land became a graveyard of twisted trees and perpetual night, and Malric's cursed form, now known as the Black-Horned Demon, would roam forever, feeding on the fear and despair of those foolish enough to enter his domain. In modern times, the legend of the Black-Horned Demon had become little more than a local myth. But to 4 urban explorers, the forest represented an irresistible challenge. Ethan, a filmmaker obsessed with capturing the supernatural, led the group. Accompanying him were Clara, a writer seeking inspiration; Mike, a skeptic with a knack for sarcasm; and Lila, a quiet and introspective student who tagged along out of curiosity. They arrived at the edge of the forest as the sun dipped below the horizon. Villagers watched them with a mixture of pity and fear, muttering prayers under their breath. An elderly man approached them, his hands trembling as he spoke. "Turn back," he warned. "The forest is cursed. Once the demon sees you, it will never stop hunting you." Ethan laughed nervously. "It's just a story, old man. We'll be fine." With that, they entered the forest, their flashlights piercing the encroaching darkness. The deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches resembling skeletal hands. The air grew cold, and a foul stench like rotting meat permeated the air. Lila shivered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The group stopped, straining to listen. Faint whispers drifted through the trees, too quiet to decipher but unmistakably human. Mike rolled his eyes. "It's just the wind. Don't freak out." But as they continued, the whispers grew louder, mingling with faint laughter and guttural growls. Shadows darted between the trees, always just out of sight. The group's bravado began to crumble. They reached a clearing dominated by a massive stone altar, covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Ethan approached the altar, filming every detail. "This must be where the ritual happened," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. Suddenly, a deafening scream shattered the silence. It was a sound unlike anything they had ever heard, a mix of rage, pain, and hunger. The ground trembled as a monstrous figure emerged from the shadows. The Black-Horned Demon stood before them, its grotesque form illuminated by the eerie light of the symbols. its milky, sightless eyes fixed on them, and its mouth stretched into a horrifying grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Run!" Ethan screamed, and the group scattered into the forest. The demon moved with unnatural speed, its massive claws tearing through trees as it pursued them. Lila, running blindly through the darkness, tripped over a root and fell. She turned to see the demon looming over her, its breath hot and rancid. Just as it reached for her, a bright flash from Ethan's camera distracted it, giving her enough time to scramble away. "This way!" Ethan shouted, leading the group toward an old, dilapidated cabin they had passed earlier. They barricaded themselves inside, breathing heavily as the sounds of the demon's growls echoed outside. "What the hell is that thing?" Mike demanded, his voice shaking. Clara examined the symbols etched into the cabin's walls. "These markings, they're meant to keep it out. This place might be our only safe haven." But as the night wore on, the demon's screams grew louder, and the cabin's walls began to shake. The group realized that their sanctuary would not hold for long. Clara found an old journal hidden beneath the floorboards, written by one of the villagers who had attempted to banish the demon centuries ago. The ritual required a sacrifice, a life willingly given to trap the demon within the altar once more. "We have to do it," Clara said. "It's the only way to stop it." Mike shook his head. "No way. There's got to be another way." "There isn't," Ethan said grimly. "One of us has to stay behind." The group returned to the altar, the demon close on their heels. As it lunged toward them, Ethan shoved Lila and Clara aside, placing himself in its path. "Go!" he shouted. "Finish the ritual!" Lila and Clara recited the incantation from the journal as the demon tore into Ethan. His screams echoed through the forest, but the ritual began to take effect. The symbols on the altar blazed with light, and the demon's form twisted and contorted, its screams turning into a deafening roar as it was pulled into the altar. When the light faded, the forest was silent. The demon was gone, but so was Ethan. Lila and Clara stumbled out of the forest at dawn, their bodies battered and their minds scarred. The villagers watched in silence as they emerged, their haunted eyes telling the story of what had transpired. But as the two survivors tried to move on with their lives, they were plagued by nightmares. In every shadow, they saw the glint of horns. In every silence, they heard the demons scream, and deep within the forest, the altar still pulsed faintly, a reminder that the curse was not truly broken. For the black-horned demon waits, watching, and one day it will rise again. Story 2: The Crimson Death, a tale of eternal horror. In a world scorched by the sun's fiery glare and the haunting glow of a fractured crimson moon, there exists a desolate wasteland where no life can thrive. Among its cracked and barren ground stands a shrine cloaked in blood-red mist. At the heart of this forsaken land resides a being of unimaginable dread, the Crimson Death. Draped in tattered crimson robes that flow like liquid fire, with skeletal hands that beckon and an aura of death that chokes the air, this entity is not just a myth. It is doom incarnate. Centuries ago, there was a kingdom named Azareth, a land of unparalleled beauty and prosperity. Its ruler, King Eldon, was both revered and feared. Obsessed with eternal power, he sought ways to conquer death itself. Whispers of an ancient ritual that could summon the essence of immortality reached his ears. Ignoring the warnings of his advisors and clergy, Eldon prepared a grand ceremony under the light of a blood moon. On the fateful night, Eldon, accompanied by his priests, performed the ritual atop a sacrificial altar in the kingdom's central temple. The blood of thousands flowed into the cracks of the earth as incantations echoed through the night. But instead of eternal life, Eldon awakened the Crimson Death, a cosmic entity born of destruction and despair. The being emerged from the void, its robes flowing like rivers of blood, and its hollow skull radiating an unholy light. "You have summoned me," it spoke, its voice reverberating like the wails of the damned. "For this, your kingdom will perish." With a single gesture, the Crimson Death unleashed its wrath. The land burned, the sky fractured, and every living soul in Azareth was consumed, their bodies reduced to ash. Eldon himself was cursed, his soul forever bound within the entity, trapped in eternal torment. The ruins of Azareth became a wasteland, and the Crimson Death remained dormant, waiting for the foolish and the curious to disturb its slumber. In the present day, the legend of Azareth and its supposed riches had faded into obscurity. But to Marcus, an ambitious treasure hunter, the myth represented an opportunity for fame and fortune. Joining him on the expedition were Evelyn, a historian driven by an obsession with forbidden knowledge, Tom, a pragmatic engineer, and Lila, a young archaeologist eager to prove her worth. The journey to the wasteland was treacherous. As they approached the ruins, the sky darkened unnaturally, and the ground beneath their feet cracked and groaned. A suffocating sense of dread settled over them as they stood before the massive, decaying temple at the center of the wasteland. Its spire reached toward the fractured moon, and its entrance was shrouded in the crimson mist. "This place, it feels alive," Lila whispered, clutching her journal tightly. Marcus smirked. "Alive with treasure, maybe." "Let's move." Inside the temple, the group found walls inscribed with cryptic symbols that seemed to writhe when viewed too long. At the center of the grand chamber lay a colossal stone coffin, bound by chains etched with glowing red runes. Evelyn examined the markings, her voice trembling. "This isn't a coffin, it's a prison." "Prison or not, something valuable must be inside," Marcus said, motioning Tom to cut the chains. Despite Evelyn's protests, Tom used his tools to sever the glowing chains. As the last chain fell, the ground trembled violently and the crimson mist thickened. The air grew unbearably cold, and a piercing scream erupted from the coffin as the lid slid open. From within, the Crimson Death rose, its skeletal frame adorned with flowing red robes that seemed to bleed into the air. "You have freed me," it intoned, its empty eye sockets burning with a terrible light. "Now you will join me." The Crimson Death stretched its arms, and the crimson mist erupted into tendrils that lashed out at the group. Tom was the first to fall, his screams cut short as the mist enveloped him, stripping his flesh from his bones in seconds. His skeletal remains crumbled to dust, leaving only his tools behind. "Run!" Marcus shouted, dragging Lila and Evelyn out of the chamber. The group fled through the labyrinthine temple, the Crimson Death's laughter echoing around them. The walls seemed to close in, and the air became heavy with despair. Evelyn stumbled, clutching her journal. "The ritual," she gasped. We can seal it again." "How?" Marcus demanded, panic etched on his face. Evelyn flipped through the journal, her hands shaking. "We need to bind it to the altar, with a sacrifice." The group returned to the grand chamber where the Crimson Death awaited them. Its presence was overwhelming, a swirling maelstrom of crimson energy. Evelyn began reciting the incantation from the journal, her voice trembling but resolute. The runes on the altar glowed faintly, reacting to her words. The Crimson Death moved to silence her, but Marcus intercepted it, wielding a torch. "Over my dead body," he yelled, swinging the flame at the entity. The torch passed harmlessly through the robes, and Marcus was thrown against the wall by an unseen force. "You cannot fight me," the Crimson Death said, its voice a cacophony of whispers and screams. "Your souls are mine." Evelyn's chanting reached a crescendo, and the runes flared brighter. But the ritual required more power. Lila realized the truth as she looked at the altar. "It needs a life," she said, her voice barely audible. "One of us has to stay." Before anyone could protest, Lila stepped onto the altar. She met Evelyn's tear-filled gaze and smiled faintly. "Finish it." Evelyn hesitated, but Marcus, bloodied and broken, nodded. "Do it. End this." With a heavy heart, Evelyn completed the incantation. The runes blazed with a blinding light, and the crimson death let out an ear-splitting roar. Tendrils of crimson energy lashed out, but the light consumed them, drawing the entity back into the coffin. As the lid slammed shut, the temple began to collapse. Evelyn and Marcus emerged from the ruins as the first rays of dawn pierced the crimson sky. The wasteland was silent, the oppressive mist dissipated. But the cost was immense. Lila was gone, her sacrifice sealing the crimson death once more. For days after their return, Evelyn was haunted by dreams of Lila standing on the altar, her face serene as the light consumed her. But the dreams soon turned to nightmares. In them, the crimson death whispered, "The seal will not hold forever. I will return." Marcus, racked with guilt and trauma, vanished without a trace. Evelyn devoted her life to ensuring that no one would ever awaken the entity again. But deep in the wasteland, beneath the fractured moon, the temple still stands, and the coffin still pulses faintly with crimson light. And so, the crimson death waits, biding its time, for the next fool to release it from its eternal prison. Story 3. The Haunted Spirit of Amelia Ravensworth. In the rolling hills of a forgotten countryside stands a house so sinister that even the boldest souls dare not approach it. Known simply as the House of the Wandering Spirit, this decrepit mansion is veiled in eternal twilight, casting long shadows that seem to move of their own accord. Every full moon, locals speak of a ghostly figure, a pale, hollow-eyed girl in a tattered white gown, floating above the grounds, her mournful cries piercing the still night. Many have tried to uncover the truth of this cursed place, and none have ever returned. 2 centuries ago, the mansion belonged to the Ravensworths, an influential and reclusive family. The only daughter, Amelia Ravensworth, was the jewel of their lineage, beautiful, kind-hearted, and adored by the few who knew her. But beneath the family's opulent facade lay dark secrets. It was whispered that the Ravensworths practiced forbidden rituals to maintain their wealth and power, rituals that demanded sacrifices. On a fateful night under the light of a blood moon, the villagers, driven by fear and anger, stormed the mansion. They accused the family of witchcraft and set the estate ablaze. The Ravensworths perished in the flames, and Amelia, trapped in her room on the upper floor, screamed for help as the fire consumed her. Her cries echoed across the valley, carrying with them a curse. When the fire died, nothing remained of the family but ash. Yet Amelia's soul lingered, tethered to the house that had betrayed her. Twisted by rage and sorrow, she became a vengeful specter, bound to the mansion and its surrounding grounds, forever mourning her stolen life. The legend of the Ravensworth mansion became a local horror story, but as the years passed, it caught the attention of thrill seekers and skeptics. One such group consisted of 4 friends. James, a filmmaker eager to create a paranormal documentary. Clara, a journalist seeking her next big story. Evan, a skeptic who loved debunking ghost stories. And Lila, a quiet archaeology student with a fascination for history. On the night of a full moon, they arrived at the edge of the mansion's property. The air was unnaturally cold, and the sound of the wind carried a faint, sorrowful melody. Despite their unease, James pressed forward, camera in hand. "We'll be fine," he assured the others, though his voice lacked conviction. The group entered the mansion, the creak of the front door echoing like a death knell. Inside, the air was heavy with decay. Furniture lay in ruins, and the walls were adorned with faded portraits whose eyes seemed to follow them. As James filmed the eerie interior, Lila noticed faint footprints leading up the grand staircase. "These look fresh," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's just an animal," Evan replied dismissively. But as they ascended the stairs, the temperature plummeted, and a low, keening wail filled the air. In the master bedroom, they found a mirror, its surface covered in a thick layer of grime. Clara wiped it clean, and all four gasped. Reflected in the glass was not their own image, but that of Amelia. Her sunken eyes staring at them, her mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. The mirror shattered, and the wail became a piercing shriek. The group fled the room, but the sound followed them, growing louder with every step. As they scrambled through the house, the walls seemed to close in. Shadows slithered along the floor, forming twisted hands that clawed at their ankles. The group became separated in the chaos. James and Clara found themselves in the basement, while Evan and Lila ended up in a locked parlor. In the basement, James discovered a journal belonging to Amelia. The pages told of her loneliness and despair, of how she had begged her parents to stop their dark practices. The final entry read, "They will burn for their sins, but so will I. If I must suffer, so shall all who enter this house." Upstairs, Evan and Lila faced horrors of their own. The fireplace roared to life, and from the flames emerged ghostly figures screaming in agony. Amelia appeared behind them, her form flickering between human and monstrous. She raised a skeletal hand, and Evan was thrown violently against the wall. "You cannot escape," she hissed, her voice echoing with anguish. Clara pieced together a solution from Amelia's journal. "She's not just angry, she's in pain," Clara said. "We need to perform a ritual to release her soul." "And what if it doesn't work?" James asked, his voice shaking. "Then we die here," Clara replied grimly. They regrouped in the grand hall, but Amelia was waiting. Her form towered above them, her crimson eyes burning with fury. The house trembled as she raised her arms, and the floor cracked open, revealing an abyss of writhing souls. "You will join me," she intoned, her voice a symphony of despair. Clara began reciting the ritual from the journal, her voice barely audible over Amelia's wails. James and Evan tried to hold the ghost at bay, using broken furniture as makeshift weapons, but their efforts were futile. Amelia's shadowy tendrils wrapped around Evan, pulling him into the abyss. His screams echoed as he vanished. "Keep going," James shouted, his camera still rolling as he was lifted off the ground by an unseen force. Clara's chanting grew louder, and a blinding light erupted from the journal. Amelia screamed, her form disintegrating into ash. The house began to collapse, and Clara and Lila barely escaped as the mansion was consumed by flames. When they reached the safety of the forest, Clara and Lila turned to see the mansion reduced to rubble. But the victory was hollow. James and Evan were gone, and the memory of Amelia's face haunted them. In the weeks that followed, Clara began hearing whispers in the night. Lila dreamed of the house, whole again, with Amelia waiting at the window. One night, under a full moon, Clara awoke to find the journal on her bedside table. The final page, once blank, now bore a single line. "You freed me, but the curse remains. I will wait for you." And far away, in the ruins of the Ravensworth mansion, the pale figure of Amelia can still be seen under the light of the full moon, her hollow eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the next souls to enter her domain. Would you dare to face her? Story 4. The Fields of Eternal Chains. Far away from civilization, hidden in the shadow of a forgotten forest, lies a place whispered about only in hushed tones. The Fields of Eternal Chains. By day, it is a desolate wasteland where skeletal remains sit upright in shallow graves, bound by rusted chains that seem to grow like roots. By night, it is a realm of nightmares, where the dead rise to roam under the pale light of a full moon. The locals fear this place, for it is said to be cursed. Long ago, the dead who rest there committed unspeakable crimes against the living and were condemned to eternal torment by a powerful ritual. But over time, the curse began to waver, and the souls trapped in the graves grew restless. Now, anyone who dares to enter the fields risks waking them. Few dared to explore the fields of eternal chains. But one night, 3 thrill-seekers decided to challenge the legend. Ethan, a documentary filmmaker, wanted footage for his channel. Mia, a historian, sought to uncover the truth behind the curse. Lila, a skeptic, joined to debunk the legend and mock their fears. "It's just old folklore," Lila scoffed as they arrived at the edge of the forest. "People need to grow up." Ethan adjusted his camera. "If we can record even a shred of paranormal activity, this could go viral." Mia, clutching her notebook, looked uneasy. "You don't understand. The chains are symbols of something greater. If the stories are true..." Ethan cut her off. "Then we'll have the best footage anyone's ever seen." They reached the fields just as the moon rose high in the sky. The landscape was haunting. Rows upon rows of shallow graves stretched into the horizon. Each grave held a skeleton, sitting upright, its bones bleached white and its skull staring blankly ahead. Rusted chains bound their arms, legs, and torsos to the ground. Ethan zoomed in with his camera. "This is incredible," he whispered. "It's like something out of a horror movie." Mia examined the ground, noticing symbols etched into the dirt around each grave. "These are wards," she murmured. "They're meant to keep the dead contained." Lila laughed. "They're just scratches in the dirt, nothing to be scared of." But as they ventured deeper into the fields, the air grew colder. The chains rattled faintly, though there was no wind. Ethan stopped, focusing his camera on a nearby skeleton. Its empty eye sockets seemed to be staring back at him. "Did it just move?" he asked. "Don't be ridiculous," Lila replied, though her voice wavered. As they continued filming, a low groan echoed across the field. Mia froze. "Did you hear that?" Ethan nodded, his face pale. "It came from over there." The group approached cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. One of the skeletons had shifted. Its head tilted to the side, and its jaw hung open as if mid-scream. "That's not possible," Lila whispered. "It's just a trick of the light." Suddenly, the chains binding the skeleton began to rattle violently. One by one, the links snapped, and the skeleton stood, its movements jerky but purposeful. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly red as it turned toward them. "Run!" Mia screamed. As the group fled, the ground beneath them began to tremble. More chains snapped, and more skeletons rose from their graves. The air filled with the sound of rattling chains and unearthly moans. Ethan kept his camera rolling, capturing the chaos. "This is insane," he shouted. "They're all waking up." The group took refuge behind a crumbling stone altar at the center of the field. Mia frantically flipped through her notebook. "There has to be a way to stop them. The wards. If we can reactivate the wards, we can trap them again." "How?" Ethan asked, panting. Mia pointed to the symbols carved into the altar. "We need to recite the binding ritual, but it requires a sacrifice." Lila's face turned pale. "A sacrifice? You can't be serious." Mia ignored her, focusing on the ancient text. The curse was designed to contain their evil. Without the ritual, they'll consume everything. The skeletons surrounded the altar, their glowing eyes fixed on the group. Chains snaked through the air like living things, striking at them. Ethan swung his camera tripod like a weapon, but the chains wrapped around it, ripping it from his hands. Mia began chanting the ritual, her voice steady despite the terror around her. The symbols on the altar glowed faintly, but the skeletons grew more aggressive, as if sensing their impending doom. One of the chains struck Mia, knocking her to the ground. Her notebook fell into the dirt, pages scattering. Lila picked it up, her hands trembling. "We have to finish this," Lila said. "I'll do it." "No," Ethan said. "I started this. It's my fault. I'll do it." Before Lila could protest, Ethan grabbed a shard of broken stone and pressed it to his palm, drawing blood. He placed his hand on the altar, and the symbols flared to life. The skeletons let out a collective scream, their bodies disintegrating into ash as the chains reattached themselves to the graves. The ground rumbled one last time before falling silent. Lila helped Mia to her feet, but Ethan was gone. All that remained of him was his blood-stained handprint on the altar. The fields were quiet once more. The skeletons returned to their graves, their chains secured. Mia and Lila stumbled out of the forest as dawn broke, their minds scarred by what they had witnessed. Weeks later, Lila received a package containing Ethan's camera. The footage showed the events of that night, but at the very end, there was something more. A brief clip of Ethan standing in the fields, his eyes glowing red, a chain wrapped around his neck. "I'm still here," his voice whispered, "and I'm not alone." In the distance, the sound of chains rattling grew louder. Would you dare to step into the fields of eternal chains? Story 5. The Curse of the Shadowed Lovers. Long ago, before time dulled the edges of memory, there was a kingdom called Alaris, a land blessed with beauty but cursed with tragedy. Among the kingdom's many tales, one was whispered in fear, the legend of the Shadowed Lovers, two beings bound by love but doomed by darkness. They were said to appear in places where betrayal, despair, and death lingered, their forms ethereal, their presence suffocating. Their story was one of passion turned to torment, love twisted into eternal suffering. When the moon hung high and the winds howled through desolate places, it was believed they danced together, a macabre waltz that trapped any who dared to watch. Centuries ago, in the heart of Alaris, lived Serena, the daughter of the kingdom's high sorcerer, and Arian, a humble poet. Their love was a secret, for Serena's father forbade her from mingling with those he deemed unworthy. Despite the danger, Serena and Arian met in secret, their bond growing stronger with each stolen moment. One fateful night, under the silver glow of a full moon, they vowed to run away together. But Serena's father, Lord Malvus, discovered their plan. Enraged, he used his dark magic to bind them forever. "If you wish to be together for eternity," he spat, "then you shall have it, in shadow and agony." The curse transformed them into wraith-like beings, their bodies twisted and ethereal. Their love remained, but it became a torment, each touch bringing pain, each glance a reminder of their suffering. Bound to each other and the curse, they roamed the kingdom, drawing others into their eternal dance of despair. Over time, the tale of the shadowed lovers faded into myth, but whispers of their existence persisted. In a quiet town near the ruins of Alaris, a group of friends became fascinated by the legend. Ethan, a filmmaker, saw it as the perfect subject for his next project. Clara, an anthropologist, hoped to uncover the truth behind the story. Liam, an adrenaline junkie, simply craved the thrill. And Sophia, Ethan's sister, reluctantly joined, wary but unwilling to leave her brother alone. If we can capture footage of anything paranormal, Ethan said as they packed their gear, we'll be famous. Clara adjusted her glasses, flipping through her notebook. The ruins of Alaris are said to be where they first appeared. If the legend is true, that's where we'll find them. Sophia hesitated. What if the curse is real? Liam laughed. Then we'll make history. The group set off at dusk, the ruins of Alaris shrouded in fog and mystery. As they approached, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. The air was thick, heavy with an unspoken threat. They reached the crumbling remains of the kingdom, where the walls seemed to whisper and the wind carried faint, mournful cries. This place is eerie, Sophia murmured. It's perfect, Ethan replied, setting up his camera. Let's split up and cover more ground. Clara protested. We should stay together. The legend is just a story, Liam interrupted, venturing deeper into the ruins. Reluctantly, the others followed. As night fell, the ruins seemed to come alive. Shadows lengthened and twisted unnaturally, and the air grew colder. Clara, examining carvings on an ancient wall, noticed something strange. These symbols, she whispered. They're warnings. This place isn't safe. Before she could elaborate, a chilling voice echoed through the ruins. You dare intrude upon our domain? The group froze. From the shadows emerged two figures, their forms shrouded in darkness, their faces pale and hollow. Arian and Serena stood hand in hand, their glowing eyes filled with sorrow and rage. Who are you? Ethan stammered, raising his camera. Serena stepped forward, her voice a haunting melody. We are what remains of love betrayed. You should not have come. The air grew heavy as the shadowed lovers began to move, their steps fluid yet unnatural. The ground trembled with each motion, and the group found themselves unable to look away. An invisible force pulled them closer, their bodies moving against their will, drawn into the lovers' macabre dance. What's happening? Sophia cried, her voice trembling. It's the curse, Clara shouted. They're trapping us. Liam struggled, but his limbs felt like lead. We have to break free. Ethan, still holding his camera, aimed it at the lovers. But as he pressed record, the lens shattered and a shadow engulfed him. He screamed as his body twisted, his face contorting in terror before he vanished into the darkness. Clara, frantically flipping through her notes, found a possible solution. There's a ritual, she gasped. It can break the curse, but it requires a sacrifice. Sophia's eyes widened. What kind of sacrifice? Clara looked away. A life. Before they could react, Arian and Serena appeared before them. Serena's voice was soft but piercing. You cannot escape. Join us, and you will know eternal love and eternal pain. Liam, his voice shaking, stepped forward. Take me. Let them go. No! Clara and Sophia shouted in unison, but it was too late. Liam reached out to the lovers, his body enveloped in shadow. He turned to the others one last time, a faint smile on his face. Tell the world our story. With Liam's sacrifice, the lovers paused. Serena wept, and Arian looked to the sky. At last, he whispered, we are free. Their forms dissolved into light, and the ruins fell silent. Clara and Sophia stumbled out of the ruins as dawn broke, their minds haunted by what they had witnessed. Ethan's camera was gone, and Liam was never found. The ruins of Alaris crumbled further, as if the curse had finally lifted. But the story did not end there. Weeks later, Clara began dreaming of the shadowed lovers, their forms clearer with each passing night. One evening, Sophia found a note on her desk, written in Liam's handwriting. The dance isn't over. They're waiting. In the distance, under the pale light of a full moon, shadows began to stir once more. Would you dare to enter the ruins of Alaris and face the shadowed lovers? Story 6. The Curse of the Spider's Skull. Deep in the heart of an ancient forest lies a forbidden glade shrouded in eternal shadow. At its center sits an eerie relic, a human skull, cracked and weathered, covered in an endless web of black spiders. Known as the Spider's Skull, it is said to be the final resting place of Arachna, the Spider Witch, a sorceress who struck fear into the hearts of all who dared cross her path. Legends tell of her insatiable hunger for power and the dark rituals she performed to control legions of spiders as her deadly servants. Centuries ago, the villagers of Velmont banded together to destroy her. They captured Arachna, dragging her to the forest where they performed a ritual to sever her connection to the mortal world. But before her spirit could be banished, she cursed the land and promised to return, saying, "I will rise again, and my children will feast on your souls." Since then, no one who ventures into the forest returns. Those brave enough to approach the glade speak of shadows that move on their own, of whispers in the dark, and of spiders so large their glowing red eyes pierce the night. In the present day, 4 friends set out to document the legend of the Spider's Skull. Mark, a thrill-seeking filmmaker, led the group. Lila, a budding journalist, hoped the story would launch her career. Ethan, a skeptic and biologist, wanted to debunk the myths. Sophia, the most cautious of the group, joined reluctantly, driven more by loyalty than curiosity. "This will be the biggest discovery of our lives," Mark said as they packed their gear. "Or the dumbest thing we've ever done," Sophia muttered. Ethan smirked. "Relax. It's just an overgrown skull and some spiders. Nothing supernatural about it." Lila, clutching her notebook, added, "If there's even a shred of truth to the legend, we'll be famous." Think of the headlines. With high spirits and cameras in hand, they entered the forest at dusk, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. As they ventured deeper, the forest grew darker and more oppressive. The trees twisted unnaturally, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the faint scent of decay. Webs began to appear, at first small and delicate, but soon sprawling across entire trees, thick with clusters of black spiders. "I don't like this," Sophia whispered. "It feels wrong." Mark rolled his eyes. "It's just a forest. Don't let the atmosphere get to you." But even Ethan, the group's skeptic, couldn't ignore the eerie silence. There were no birds, no insects, only the faint rustling of unseen creatures. As they approached the heart of the forest, the webs grew denser, forming a labyrinth of sticky threads. They had to push and cut their way through, their movements slow and deliberate. The faint whispers began, a soft, rhythmic sound, like voices speaking just out of earshot. "Did you hear that?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. "It's the wind," Ethan replied, though his confidence wavered. After hours of trudging through the forest, they reached the glade. In the moonlight, the spider's skull glowed faintly, its hollow eyes staring into the void. Spiders swarmed over its surface, their legs clicking as they moved. Surrounding the skull were remnants of the ancient ritual: scorched earth, crumbling runes, and shattered relics. "Is this it?" Mark asked, awestruck. He raised his camera, filming the grotesque scene. "We found it." Lila approached cautiously, her notebook in hand. The markings around the skull, they matched the descriptions from the legend. Ethan crouched beside the skull, studying the spiders. "These are enormous. They shouldn't even exist in this ecosystem." Sophia stood back, her eyes darting nervously. "We shouldn't be here. This place isn't natural." Mark ignored her, stepping closer to the skull. Imagine the footage we'll get if I touch it, he said with a grin. Don't, Sophia shouted, but it was too late. Mark reached out and placed his hand on the skull. The moment Mark's fingers brushed the skull, the ground trembled. The spiders scattered, disappearing into the shadows. A low, guttural whisper echoed through the glade, growing louder and more menacing. You dare disturb my slumber? The voice hissed. The skull's hollow eyes began to glow red, and black tendrils of shadow seeped from its cracks, coiling around Mark's arm. He screamed, dropping the camera. The tendrils spread quickly, wrapping around his body and pulling him toward the skull. Help me, Mark shouted, his voice filled with terror. Ethan and Lila rushed to pull him back, but the shadows were too strong. They could only watch in horror as Mark's body twisted and contorted, his screams fading into the darkness. When the shadows receded, all that remained was the skull, now surrounded by a fresh web of glowing red threads. The ground erupted as thousands of spiders emerged, their red eyes glowing like embers. They swarmed toward the group, their chittering echoing like a cacophony of whispers. Run, Ethan shouted, grabbing Sophia's hand. They sprinted through the forest, but the spiders were relentless. Lila tripped, and the swarm engulfed her. Her screams pierced the night, but the others couldn't stop. Tears streamed down Sophia's face as they fled, the sounds of Lila's agony haunting them. Ethan and Sophia stumbled upon an ancient stone altar, its surface etched with runes similar to those around the skull. Sophia, clutching Lila's fallen notebook, found notes about a banishment ritual. We can stop this, she said, her voice shaking. But it requires a sacrifice. Ethan hesitated. What kind of sacrifice? Sophia looked at him, her expression grim. A life. Before Ethan could respond, the spiders descended. They surrounded the altar, their movements deliberate. In the shadows, the figure of Arachna began to form, a grotesque amalgamation of woman and spider, her voice a chilling melody. You cannot escape, she said. Join me, and I will spare your suffering. Sophia stepped forward, clutching a dagger from the altar. Number this ends here. With a final glance at Ethan, she plunged the dagger into her chest. Her blood spilled onto the runes, which began to glow brightly. A blinding light engulfed the glade, and the spiders shrieked as they dissolved into ash. Arachna's scream was the loudest of all, her form disintegrating as the curse was broken. Story 7. The Pact of Zalgrim. A Tale of Eternal Damnation. Long ago, in the shadowed corners of time, a demon known as Zalgrim, the Lord of Hearts, emerged from the depths of hell. Unlike other lords of the underworld, Zalgrim wielded not just raw power, but an intoxicating charm. He didn't merely destroy souls, he seduced them, entwining their fates with his dark promises. Those who dared summon him often found their hearts filled with unbearable longing and despair, their desires twisted into nightmares. The legend said Zalgrim would only appear to those who, in moments of ultimate desperation, called upon the void. He would offer them the power to change their fates, but always at a devastating price. For every wish granted, a piece of their soul would be consumed, leaving them hollow, and in the end, Zalgrim would claim their hearts as trophies for his infernal collection. In the isolated village of Elithra, there lived a man named Ethan Glaive. Once a prosperous merchant, Ethan's life had unraveled after a series of cruel misfortunes. His wife, Clara, had been killed during a robbery. His business was ruined by a rival's betrayal, and his son, Caleb, lay dying of an incurable illness. Driven to the brink of madness, Ethan wandered into the forest near his village one moonless night, clutching an old tome he had purchased from a traveling merchant. The book was said to contain ancient rituals capable of summoning beings from beyond. Under the skeletal trees, Ethan lit the ritual candles and drew the runes as instructed. His hands trembled as he spoke the incantation. Zalgrim, Lord of Hearts, I summon thee. Hear my plea and grant me the power to reclaim what I've lost. The air grew icy, and the flames of the candles turned black. A crimson mist coiled around Ethan, and from it emerged Zalgrim. His massive horns spiraled upward, his wings cast an oppressive shadow, and his glowing red eyes pierced through Ethan's soul. He smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth. You have called, and I have come, Zalgrim said, his voice a melody of silk and steel. What is it you desire, mortal? Ethan fell to his knees. I want my enemies to suffer. I want the strength to protect my son. I want revenge for Clara. Zalgrim chuckled, a deep, resonant sound. Such ambition, such pain. I can grant your desires. For a price. Ethan hesitated. What price? Your heart, Zalgrim replied, extending a clawed hand. Not your life, but the essence of your being. You will gain immeasurable power, but each time you use it, your humanity will fade. And when the time comes, I will claim what is mine. Desperate, Ethan agreed. He took the demon's hand, and pain unlike any he'd known coursed through his body. When it subsided, he felt the change. Strength surged in his veins and his vision sharpened. But a hollow ache lingered in his chest. Ethan returned to Elithra transformed. His newfound power allowed him to exact brutal revenge on those who had wronged him. The rival who sabotaged his business was found mutilated in his home, his heart missing. The thieves who had killed Clara were hunted down one by one, their bodies left as warnings. At first, the villagers whispered of divine justice, but soon they began to fear Ethan. His demeanor grew colder, his voice more hollow. Even Caleb, whom Ethan had saved from the brink of death using his demonic power, seemed afraid of his father. Father, Caleb said one night, his voice trembling, what have you become? Ethan couldn't answer. He avoided his reflection, for each time he caught sight of himself, he saw how his eyes had taken on the same infernal glow as Zalgrim's. His once loving heart now beat with a dark, unnatural rhythm. Years passed, and Ethan's deeds became legend, but his victories were hollow. Caleb, now grown, distanced himself from his father, and Ethan's soul felt increasingly fragmented. One night, as Ethan sat alone in the house that had once been filled with love, the candles around him flickered and dimmed. You've done well, Zalgrim said, materializing in the corner of the room. His grin was wider than ever. But it is time to honor our contract. No, Ethan stood, trembling with rage. You promised me time. My work isn't done. Zalgrim tilted his head. Your work will never be done. That is the nature of desire, but I have come for what you owe me. Ethan's chest burned as the ache in his heart intensified. He fell to his knees, clutching at his chest. Please, he begged, there must be another way. Zalgrim knelt before him, his voice mockingly tender. There is no other way, Ethan. You traded your heart for power. Now it belongs to me. With a swift motion, Zalgrim plunged his clawed hand into Ethan's chest. Ethan screamed as Zalgrim extracted his still-beating heart, now blackened and pulsing with infernal energy. As his body crumpled to the floor, Ethan's soul was pulled into the heart, trapped for eternity. Zalgrim returned to his domain, adding Ethan's heart to his collection. Each heart in his throne room pulsed faintly, each one a testament to a mortal who had succumbed to despair. But Ethan's story didn't end there. The village of Elithra was never the same. Caleb, haunted by his father's deeds, began hearing whispers in the night. They spoke of power, of revenge, of salvation, all promises wrapped in the seductive tones of Zalgrim. One moonless night, Caleb stood at the edge of the forest, clutching the same ancient tome his father had once used. He hesitated, his hand trembling over the ritual circle. In the shadows, Zalgrim watched, his grin widening. "Go on, child," he murmured. "The cycle must continue." And as Caleb began to chant, the forest trembled, and the crimson mist began to rise once more. Would you dare summon Zalgrim and risk everything for the chance to rewrite your fate? Story 8. The Curse of the Death Ship. Far across the darkest oceans, where storms never cease and sunlight dares not reach, sailors whisper of an unholy vessel known as the Skull-born Leviathan. Unlike any other ship, its prow is carved into the grotesque form of a human skull, its empty eye sockets glowing faintly with an ominous red light. It is said to emerge from the depths during storms, bringing ruin to all who encounter it. This ship does not carry cargo, but collects something far more sinister: the souls of the damned. The legend speaks of an ancient admiral, Dorian Ashvan, who sought immortality through forbidden magic. He betrayed his entire fleet, performing a blood ritual that condemned his crew to an eternity of servitude. The ship was transformed into a vessel of death, and Dorian became its eternal captain, steering it endlessly across the seas in search of more souls to feed his unholy curse. In the modern era, such tales had become little more than maritime folklore, used to frighten novice sailors. But for Captain Elias Grant and his crew of the merchant vessel Wavebreaker, these stories would soon become horrifyingly real. Elias was a pragmatic man, uninterested in myths. His goal was simple: transport precious cargo across the treacherous southern seas and return with his pockets lined with gold. His crew included Anya, a seasoned navigator, Samuel, a superstitious deckhand, and Victor, the ship's grizzled first mate. As they prepared to set sail, the villagers warned them. "The skies are angry," an old man rasped. "And this route takes you near the Devil's Abyss. That's where the Skull-born Leviathan hunts." Elias dismissed their warnings with a wave of his hand. "Nonsense. We've weathered worse storms than this. Let's move." For the first 2 days, the voyage was uneventful. The seas were calm, and the crew's spirits were high. But on the third night, everything changed. A dense fog descended upon the Wavebreaker, shrouding the ship in an eerie silence. The usual sounds of the ocean, waves lapping against the hull, seagulls crying overhead, were gone. Anya was the first to sense something amiss. "Captain, the compass, it's spinning wildly," she said, her voice trembling. Samuel, already jittery, muttered, "It's the Leviathan." "I've heard the stories. This is how it begins." Elias scowled. "Enough with the ghost stories. Keep your focus." But even he couldn't ignore the strange occurrences. The waves grew unnaturally still, as if the ocean itself held its breath. A faint rhythmic thudding began to echo through the fog, like the beat of a massive drum. Then, from the distance, they saw it. A colossal ship emerging from the mist, its prow unmistakably shaped like a skull. The crew froze in terror as the Leviathan drew closer, its tattered sails flapping despite the still air. The glow from its skull's eyes illuminated the deck of the Wavebreaker, casting long, sinister shadows. The skull-born Leviathan pulled alongside the Wavebreaker, its hull impossibly tall and covered in carvings of writhing, tormented figures. From its deck, ghostly figures appeared, what remained of Admiral Dorian Ashvane's cursed crew. Their hollow eyes burned with malevolence, and their skeletal hands gripped rusted weapons. A booming voice rang out, chilling the blood of everyone aboard. "Who dares trespass in my waters?" Elias stepped forward, his voice steady despite his fear. "We mean no harm. We're merchants passing through." Dorian Ashvane materialized at the prow of the Leviathan, his figure towering and draped in tattered naval regalia. His face was a grotesque amalgamation of bone and decayed flesh, his eyes glowing like embers. He smiled, revealing teeth sharp as knives. "All who sail these waters belong to me," he said. "Your souls will fuel my eternal voyage." Chaos erupted as the cursed crew descended onto the wavebreaker. The living fought valiantly, but their weapons passed through the spectral pirates as if striking air. The dead, however, showed no such limitations. Their blades sliced through flesh, and their skeletal hands dragged sailors into the abyss. Elias shouted orders, but his crew was overwhelmed. Victor fell first, his screams cut short as a ghostly blade pierced his chest. Samuel, paralyzed by fear, was pulled into the fog by spectral hands, his cries fading into silence. Anya, clutching a ceremonial dagger she had carried for protection, shouted, "Captain, the skull! Its glow is tied to their power. If we destroy it, we might break the curse." Elias nodded, determination hardening his features. "Cover me!" He fought his way through the chaos, reaching the ship's cannon. Loading it with an explosive charge, he aimed for the Leviathan's skull prow. The cursed crew swarmed toward him, but Anya intercepted them, slashing desperately with her dagger. With a deafening roar, the cannon fired. The projectile struck the skull, shattering it into pieces. A blinding light erupted from the Leviathan, and the spectral crew let out unearthly wails as they disintegrated into ash. The Leviathan itself began to collapse, its timbers rotting away in seconds. When the light faded, the wavebreaker floated alone in the now calm sea. Only Elias and Anya remained, both battered and bloodied. The ship was damaged, but still seaworthy. As they sailed back to port, Anya broke the silence. "We destroyed the skull. The curse should be broken." Elias shook his head, his expression grim. "Curses like that don't die so easily. We survived, but at what cost?" Months later, Elias began to notice strange things. At night, he heard faint whispers, as if carried by the wind. His dreams were plagued by visions of the Leviathan, its glowing skull prow reformed and more menacing than ever. One stormy evening, Anya came to him, her face pale. "The compass. It's spinning again." Before Elias could respond, the air grew cold, and the sound of drums echoed faintly. From the horizon, a familiar silhouette appeared. The skull-born Leviathan, fully restored, sailing toward them. Elias realized the horrifying truth. The Leviathan could not be destroyed. It was bound to him now, and it would haunt him until it claimed his soul. Would you dare to cross the devil's abyss, knowing the Leviathan waits for you? Story 9. The Cemetery of Blood. An Eternal Curse. Deep within the heart of a forgotten valley, shrouded by endless rain and veiled in perpetual mist, lies a forsaken burial ground known as the Cemetery of Blood. Unlike any other cemetery, the soil here runs thick with crimson liquid, staining the ground as if the very earth bled from ancient wounds. White skulls and skeletal remains lie exposed, scattered like remnants of a horrific massacre. The air is heavy with an iron stench, and the haunting cries of unseen entities echo faintly through the night. This cursed place is the result of a vile ritual performed centuries ago by Lord Veritas, a tyrant obsessed with achieving immortality. To secure eternal life, he sacrificed thousands of souls, using their blood to power a forbidden incantation. But his ambition backfired. Instead of ascending to godhood, Veritas was bound to the cemetery, condemned to wander its blood-soaked grounds for eternity, accompanied by the tormented souls of his victims. Anyone who dares to enter the Cemetery of Blood risks awakening its curse, becoming yet another victim of its insatiable hunger for life. On a stormy night, a group of 4 friends set out to uncover the mysteries of the Cemetery of Blood. Ethan, a daring filmmaker, sought to capture footage of the supernatural for his growing YouTube channel. Lila, a folklore researcher, hoped to verify the legends surrounding the site. Mark, a skeptic with a penchant for danger, joined to debunk the myths. And Sophia, the reluctant voice of reason, came only to keep her friends safe. "This will be the biggest breakthrough of our lives," Ethan said, adjusting his camera as they stood at the edge of the forest leading to the cemetery. "Or the worst mistake we'll ever make," Sophia muttered, her eyes scanning the dark woods nervously. "It's just a cemetery," Mark scoffed. "What's the worst that could happen? Ghosts aren't real." "They might not be," Lila replied, clutching her notebook. "But curses are." Undeterred, the group pressed onward, the promise of discovery outweighing their growing unease. As they approached the cemetery, the rain intensified, turning the path into a slick, muddy trail. The moment they crossed the rusted gates, an unnatural chill enveloped them. The rain, previously clear, now fell as droplets of faintly crimson water, soaking the ground in an even deeper shade of red. Skulls and bones littered the cemetery, half buried in the blood-drenched soil. The graves were old and weathered, their inscriptions eroded by time. But the most striking feature was the towering black mausoleum at the cemetery's center, its surface adorned with ancient runes that seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness. "This is it," Lila whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. "The heart of the curse lies in that mausoleum." Ethan pointed his camera toward the structure, his lens fogging up from the damp air. "This is incredible," he said. "I'll be the first to document this place in detail." As they ventured deeper, the rain turned thicker, almost viscous. The ground squelched beneath their boots, and the faint sound of whispers began to rise, too soft to discern but impossible to ignore. While inspecting the mausoleum, Mark, in his usual brashness, leaned against the heavy stone door. To everyone's shock, it creaked open with an eerie groan, revealing a dimly lit chamber within. "Mark," Sophia hissed, "what are you doing?" "What?" He shrugged. "We came all this way. Might as well see what's inside." Inside the mausoleum, the walls were lined with shelves of skulls, each one etched with runes similar to those on the exterior. At the center stood a stone altar, upon which lay a blood-red book bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. Lila gasped. This is Veritas's grimoire. It's said to hold the secrets of his immortality." Ethan's camera whirred as he recorded. "We need to take this with us. It's priceless." "No," Lila exclaimed. "This book is part of the curse. If we disturb it..." Before she could finish, Mark grabbed the book. The moment his fingers touched it, the runes on the walls flared to life, glowing with a sinister red light. The whispers grew louder, transforming into agonized screams. The ground trembled, and from the blood-soaked earth outside, skeletal hands began to claw their way to the surface. Screams erupted as the skeletons of Veritas's victims emerged, their hollow eyes burning with spectral fire. They moved with unnatural speed, surrounding the mausoleum. The group barely managed to barricade the door as the undead pounded against it with relentless fury. "What did you do?" Sophia yelled at Mark, who clutched the book with trembling hands. I didn't know this would happen," he stammered. Lila flipped through her notebook frantically. "The only way to stop this is to destroy the book. It's the anchor of Veritas's power." "But if we destroy it," Ethan said, "will we destroy the curse or make it worse?" Before anyone could answer, the door burst open and the skeletal horde poured in. The group scattered, dodging grasping hands and swinging bones. In the chaos, Veritas himself emerged from the shadows, his towering figure draped in a cloak of blood. His skeletal face was crowned with jagged horns, and his voice echoed with malevolent authority. You dare disturb my domain? He boomed. You will join my collection. As the undead closed in, Lila found herself cornered near the altar. Desperately, she grabbed the ceremonial dagger that rested beside the grimoire. There's no other way, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Someone has to finish this. Lila, no! Sophia cried, but it was too late. Lila plunged the dagger into the book, and a blinding light erupted from the altar. The runes on the walls shattered, and the undead let out inhuman shrieks as their bodies crumbled into ash. Veritas roared in fury, his form disintegrating as the curse unraveled. But before he vanished, he turned his fiery gaze to the group. You think this ends here? The blood of the innocent will always call to me. I will return. When the light faded, the cemetery was silent. The blood-soaked ground had dried, and the mausoleum stood dark and lifeless. But Lila was gone. All that remained was the shattered dagger and the ashes of the grimoire. Ethan, Sophia, and Mark staggered back to their car, their minds scarred by the horrors they had witnessed. Weeks later, Ethan reviewed his footage, hoping to find clarity. But as he watched, he noticed something chilling. In every frame, a shadow loomed in the background, watching them. Sophia began having nightmares of Veritas, his skeletal grin haunting her in the darkness. Mark, unable to bear the guilt, disappeared one night, leaving behind only a note. He's calling to me. I can't resist. Months later, rumors spread of a new cemetery where the ground bled and whispers filled the air. The curse had not been destroyed, only relocated, waiting for its next victims. Would you dare step into the cemetery of blood and face its eternal wrath? Story 10. The City of Death. An Oath to the Abyss. In a forgotten corner of the world, where the ocean is shrouded by an eternal fog, sailors whisper of a horrifying legend. They speak of a city of death, hidden within the mist, its towers stretching like skeletal fingers toward the heavens. In the swirling clouds above, a monstrous skull looms, its hollow eyes staring into the souls of all who dare enter its domain. This city, they say, is not of the living. It is a place where the damned gather, their fates sealed for eternity. Few who have ventured into the fog have ever returned, and those who did were forever haunted. They spoke of whispers in the mist, of a monstrous being with skeletal hands that beckoned them closer. Some claimed they saw their own deaths reflected in the city's ghostly waters, while others swore they heard the agonized screams of souls trapped forever. But the most chilling part of the tale? The city was said to choose its victims. Once you entered, you could never truly leave. In the bustling port town of Hollow Reach, 4 adventurers prepared to set sail. Ethan, a daring filmmaker, sought to capture the mysteries of the fog-shrouded city on film. Clara, a historian and skeptic, believed the legend was rooted in ancient myth and hoped to uncover its origin. Marcus, an ex-sailor with a thirst for danger, joined for the thrill. And Sophia, reluctant but loyal, followed to protect her friends from their own recklessness. As they loaded supplies onto their small boat, an old fisherman approached them. His face was weathered, and his eyes carried the weight of unspoken horrors. "You seek the city of death," he rasped. "Turn back now, while you still can." Ethan smiled, brushing off the warning. "We've faced storms and shipwrecks before. What's a little fog compared to that?" The old man's gaze hardened. "It's not the fog you should fear. It's what lies within. Once the city sees you, it never lets go." Undeterred, they set sail at dawn, their boat cutting through the calm waters as the fog began to descend. For hours, the sea was silent, save for the soft creak of the boat and the distant cry of seabirds. But as the fog thickened, the world around them grew eerily quiet. The waves became unnaturally still, as if the ocean itself held its breath. Clara frowned, her eyes scanning the horizon. This silence, it's unnatural. Marcus nodded, his grip tightening on the helm. Feels like we're being watched. Then, out of the fog, the city appeared. Towering spires loomed above the water, their surfaces cracked and weathered as if they had stood for millennia. Bridges arched between the buildings, their railings adorned with skeletal carvings. Above it all, the massive skull hovered, its empty eyes glowing faintly. Sophia shivered. It's real. The stories were true. Ethan, unable to hide his excitement, raised his camera. This is it. We're making history. They docked at a crumbling pier, the wood damp and slick with moss. The city was eerily still, its streets lined with bones and ruins. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and faint whispers echoed through the fog. Be careful, Clara warned. This place feels alive. As they ventured deeper, they discovered strange symbols etched into the walls, pulsating faintly with red light. Marcus touched one, only to recoil as a jolt of energy shot through him. This isn't just a city, he muttered. It's a trap. The group pressed on, reaching a massive square dominated by a grotesque statue of death itself. The skeletal figure held a scroll in one hand and a scythe in the other. Beneath it, an inscription read, "All who enter must pay the price. None may leave without tribute." Ethan frowned. What kind of tribute? Before anyone could answer, the ground began to tremble. From the shadows, figures emerged, twisted, half-decayed beings whose eyes burned with an unnatural light. The creatures advanced, their movements jerky and inhuman. Their whispers grew louder, forming a cacophony of despair. "Run!" Marcus shouted, drawing a knife. But the creatures were relentless, blocking every escape route. Clara, flipping through her notes, screamed, "The city doesn't want us to leave. We have to destroy the statue. It's the source of its power." Ethan and Marcus fought to hold the creatures back as Clara and Sophia sprinted toward the statue. The ground cracked beneath their feet, and skeletal hands reached up, grasping at their ankles. With a desperate cry, Clara grabbed a piece of fallen debris and smashed it against the base of the statue. A deafening roar echoed through the square as cracks spread across the stone figure. The creatures shrieked, their bodies disintegrating into ash. The fog lifted slightly, revealing the path back to the boat. The group raced back to the dock, but the city wasn't done with them. The skull above the city began to descend, its hollow eyes glowing brighter. The air grew colder, and the whispers became a deafening roar. As they leapt onto the boat, the water around them began to churn. Massive skeletal hands rose from the depths, reaching for them. Ethan, clutching his camera, screamed, "We're not going to make it." Sophia, with tears streaming down her face, whispered, "We have to try." With a final push, Marcus steered the boat out of the city's grasp. The fog closed behind them, and the city disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Back in Hollow Reach, the survivors tried to move on, but the city had left its mark. Ethan's footage was corrupted, showing only static and faint whispers. Clara became obsessed with deciphering the symbols she had seen, her mind unraveling as she delved deeper into forbidden texts. Marcus, once fearless, refused to sail again, haunted by nightmares of skeletal hands dragging him into the abyss. As for Sophia, she couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. Every night, she dreamed of the city, its towers looming in the fog, the skull's hollow eyes watching her. One night, she found a note on her desk, written in a hand that wasn't hers. It read, "The city never forgets. Neither will you." From her window, she saw the fog rolling in, thicker than ever. And in the distance, Faint but unmistakable, she heard the whispers calling her name. Would you dare to enter the city of death, knowing you may never leave?